Welcome to the Heart's Haven. Let the story begin. A poor girl refuses to let a millionaire enter the house. Seconds later, the roof collapses. Rain tapped softly against the cracked windows of the old neighborhood like fingers begging to be heard. The storm had rolled into northern Ohio just after sunset, swallowing the streets in cold wind and silver mist. Most people stayed inside, but Ethan Carter kept driving. His black SUV moved slowly through the narrow roads, lined with aging houses and leaning porches. Water shimmered across the pavement beneath the headlights. Somewhere in the distance, thunder groaned low across the sky. Ethan barely noticed. At 42, the millionaire real estate CEO had spent most of his life learning how not to feel things. Not disappointment, not grief, not loneliness. Those emotions belonged to weaker people, or at least that was what he told himself whenever the silence inside his penthouse became too loud to ignore. Tonight was supposed to be simple. Drive through the property, inspect the old houses, finalize the demolition order by Monday. That was it. No emotions, no complications. But fate rarely knocks politely. As Ethan pulled up beside the last house on the block, something immediately felt wrong. The small wooden home sat crooked beneath the storm, its porch sagging slightly to one side. The yellow porch light flickered weakly, blinking against the darkness like it was struggling to stay alive. Rainwater dripped steadily through a hole near the edge of the roof. Ethan stepped out of the SUV, adjusting the collar of his charcoal coat as cold wind rushed toward him. Then he saw her. A little girl stood barefoot on the porch. She couldn't have been older than 8. Her oversized sweater hung loosely over her thin shoulders, sleeves covering most of her hands. Damp blonde curls clung to her cheeks, and her wide blue eyes reflected the trembling porch light. But it wasn't her appearance that stopped him. It was the fear in her face. Not fear for herself, fear for him. "Don't come any closer," she said suddenly. Her voice was soft, but urgent enough to cut through the rain. Ethan frowned. "Excuse me?" The girl stepped directly in front of the doorway, spreading her arms as if her tiny body could somehow block a grown man. "Please," she whispered, "you can't go inside." For a second, Ethan almost laughed. This was exactly the kind of thing wealthy men like him were taught to ignore. A strange child, a broken house, someone else's problem. "I'm just here to inspect the property," he replied calmly. "Where are your parents?" The girl didn't answer. Instead, her eyes darted upward toward the ceiling behind her, then back to him. And that was when Ethan heard it. A sharp, cracking sound. Quiet, but wrong. The little girl lunged forward suddenly and grabbed the sleeve of his coat with both hands. "Move!" she cried. The world exploded a second later. Wood snapped overhead with a deafening crack. The front section of the roof collapsed violently onto the porch, sending splintered boards and shattered shingles crashing exactly where Ethan had been standing. Dust burst into the rain like smoke. The porch groaned beneath the impact. Ethan stumbled backward onto the wet lawn, heart hammering violently against his ribs as debris crashed inches from his feet. For one frozen moment, he couldn't breathe. Rain poured down around them. The little girl stood trembling beneath the broken porch light, still clutching his sleeve tightly in her tiny hands. And through the ringing in his ears, Ethan Carter realized something that shook him far deeper than the collapsing roof ever could. That little girl had just saved his life. For several long seconds, neither of them moved. Rain hammered against the shattered porch roof, while broken pieces of wood lay scattered across the muddy ground. Ethan Carter stood frozen beside his SUV, chest rising hard beneath his soaked coat, as adrenaline surged through his body. The little girl still held onto his sleeve, not tightly now, just enough to make sure he was still there. A strand of wet blonde hair clung to her cheek as she slowly looked up at the wreckage behind her. The old house groaned softly in the storm, as if exhausted from holding itself together for too long. Ethan swallowed hard. If she had not stopped him, He did not finish the thought. You knew that was going to happen? He asked quietly. The girl nodded once. The ceiling kept making noises, she whispered. It got worse when it rained. Her voice carried no drama, no panic, just the calm exhaustion of a child who had learned to expect dangerous things. Ethan looked at her more carefully now. Her sweater was stretched at the sleeves and several sizes too large. Her small feet were pink from the cold wooden porch. She could not have weighed more than 50 pounds, and yet somehow she had stood in the storm, trying to protect a complete stranger. Behind them, lightning flashed across the clouds, illuminating the neighborhood in pale silver for a brief moment. That was when Ethan noticed the second-floor window. A dim light still glowed upstairs. His expression changed instantly. "Is someone else inside?" he asked. The girl hesitated, then she nodded again. "My grandma," she said softly. "She cannot walk very well." Ethan felt something twist sharply in his chest. Another loud creak echoed from inside the house. The girl turned toward the doorway immediately, fear flooding her face again. "I have to get her." She tried to run past the broken beams, but Ethan reacted before he could think. He caught her gently by the shoulders. "No," he said firmly, "you are not going in there alone." For the first time since meeting her, the little girl looked angry. "She is all I have." The words hit harder than they should have. Ethan glanced toward the unstable roofline. Rainwater streamed through the damaged structure, dripping steadily through exposed wooden beams. Years of neglect were visible everywhere now. Rotting supports, cracked siding, sagging gutters hanging by rusted nails. Homes like this were numbers on reports to men like Ethan. Condemned, purchased, demolished. But standing here tonight, hearing that frightened little voice tremble in the rain, the paperwork suddenly felt ugly. "What is your name?" he asked. "Lily." "I am Ethan." She looked at him uncertainly, as though rich men introducing themselves was not something that happened often in her world. Another groan echoed through the house, this time louder. Ethan made a decision. "Stay by the car," he said calmly. "I am bringing your grandmother out." Lily immediately shook her head. "No, the stairs are weak." "You know the safe way?" She pointed toward the side of the house. "Kitchen entrance. Do not step near the hallway." The precision in her voice startled him. No child should know how to navigate a collapsing home. Ethan removed his coat and wrapped it carefully around her shoulders. The expensive wool nearly swallowed her whole. She instinctively clutched the fabric close, shivering beneath the storm. "What if it falls again?" she asked quietly. Ethan looked toward the dark house, then back at the little girl standing beneath the broken porch light. For years, people had trusted him with buildings, investments, entire city blocks. But somehow this felt heavier. "Then we move fast," he said. And before logic could stop him, Ethan Carter stepped into the collapsing house while the storm raged outside. The moment Ethan stepped inside, the smell hit him first. Damp wood, dust, cold air trapped inside walls that had been falling apart for years. Rainwater dripped steadily from the cracked ceiling, tapping against the worn linoleum floor in uneven rhythms. Somewhere deeper in the house, pipes rattled softly behind the walls. The beam flashlight from Ethan's phone cut through the darkness as he moved carefully through the narrow kitchen. Every step felt uncertain. Behind him, wind pushed rain through the broken porch entrance, carrying Lily's frightened voice from outside. "Stay away from the hallway," she called again. Ethan glanced toward the center of the house and immediately understood why. The floor dipped noticeably near the corridor, warped from years of water damage. Parts of the ceiling sagged low overhead, stained dark brown from old leaks. He could not believe people were still living here. No, surviving here. Another creak echoed above him. Ethan moved faster. "Ma'am," he called carefully. "My name is Ethan. Lily sent me." For a moment there was only silence. Then a weak voice answered from upstairs. "She should not have stayed out there in the rain." The voice sounded elderly, exhausted, gentle. Ethan spotted the staircase near the back wall. Half the railing leaned sideways, barely attached. One of the steps had collapsed completely near the center. He hesitated. In boardrooms, Ethan Carter made billion-dollar decisions without blinking. But standing at the bottom of those stairs, he felt something unfamiliar. Fear. Not for himself, for the little girl waiting outside alone. He climbed carefully, gripping the wall for balance as the old wood groaned beneath his weight. Rain hammered harder against the roof overhead now, and every sound inside the house seemed amplified by the storm. By the time he reached the second floor, his shirt clung damply against his back. A faint lamp glowed from the room at the end of the hallway. Inside sat an elderly woman wrapped in quilts, near a small space heater that flickered weakly beside her chair. Her silver hair fell loosely around her thin shoulders, and an oxygen machine hummed softly nearby. But what caught Ethan's attention most was the ceiling above her. A deep crack stretched across it, fresh, widening. "You cannot stay here," Ethan said immediately. The woman offered him a tired smile. "Lily told you that too, did she? She was trying to keep me out of the house." "She has been listening to the roof for 3 days," the grandmother whispered. "That child notices everything." Another crack sounded overhead, this one louder. Ethan crossed the room instantly. "Can you stand?" "With help?" He moved beside her carefully, surprised by how fragile she felt beneath the blankets. She was painfully light, like the house itself had slowly drained the strength from everyone living inside it. As he helped her toward the hallway, his eyes drifted briefly across the room and froze. Children's drawings covered one side of the wall. Crayon pictures, sunflowers, blue skies, a little yellow house with smoke rising from the chimney. And in every single drawing, 3 people stood holding hands. A little girl, an older woman, and a tall man with dark hair. Ethan stared for half a second too long. "Lily draws families she wishes existed," the grandmother said quietly. The words landed heavily in the silence. Downstairs, the front door suddenly banged violently from the wind. Then Lily screamed, "Ethan!" The entire house shuddered. Dust rained from the ceiling above them. The old woman gasped softly as another deep cracking noise tore through the walls. Ethan's pulse surged. "Hold on to me," he said firmly. Lightning flashed outside the hallway window as he wrapped one arm around the elderly woman and hurried toward the stairs. Below them, the lights flickered once, twice. Then everything went dark. Darkness swallowed the hallway instantly. The weak lamp upstairs died with a soft pop, leaving only flashes of lightning spilling through the rain-streaked windows. For one disorienting second, Ethan could hear nothing except the storm and the strained groaning of the old house around them. Then came Lily's voice again. "Ethan!" Fear, pure and immediate. "I am here," he shouted back. The elderly woman beside him trembled against his arm as another violent creak rippled through the ceiling overhead. Dust drifted through the darkness like gray snow. "We need to move now," Ethan said firmly. He guided her carefully toward the staircase, using the flashlight on his phone to illuminate each unstable step. The beam shook slightly in his hand, not from the cold, from the growing realization that this house was seconds away from giving up entirely. Below them, rain blew through the broken front porch. Lily stood near the doorway wrapped in Ethan's coat, her small face pale beneath the flickering lightning outside. The moment she saw her grandmother, relief flooded her eyes. "Grandma!" "I am all right, sweetheart," the older woman answered weakly. A loud, cracking sound exploded somewhere behind them upstairs. Ethan did not wait to identify it. "Out! Right now!" The 3 of them moved together through the kitchen, just as another section of ceiling collapsed in the upstairs hallway behind them. The sound thundered through the house, followed by the splintering snap of old beams giving way. Lily instinctively grabbed Ethan's hand. Her fingers were freezing. He tightened his grip without thinking. Rain slammed into them the moment they stepped outside. Wind whipped across the yard, soaking Ethan's clothes almost instantly. He hurried the grandmother toward the SUV while Lily stayed pressed close beside him. By the time they reached the vehicle, the old house let out one final groan behind them. Then part of the second-floor roof folded inward. The little girl gasped softly. Ethan opened the back door quickly, helping her grandmother inside first. Warm air from the heated seats pushed into the freezing night, fogging the windows almost immediately. Lily climbed in beside her grandmother, but kept looking back at the collapsing house. Not crying, just staring, as if she had already learned that tears did not stop bad things from happening. Ethan slid into the driver's seat and shut the door against the storm. For a moment, nobody spoke. Rain hammered against the windshield while the engine hummed softly beneath them. Then Lily quietly asked the question he was not prepared for. "Are they going to tear it down now?" Ethan looked at her through the rearview mirror. Her small face was half hidden beneath his oversized coat. Damp curls framed her blue eyes, and despite everything that had happened tonight, her first concern was not herself. It was losing the only home she had left. He glanced back toward the ruined structure outside. Hours ago, he would have called the demolition team without hesitation. Now the thought made his chest feel strangely heavy. "What matters tonight is getting both of you somewhere safe," he said gently. Lily lowered her eyes. "We do not really have anywhere else." The words lingered quietly inside the warm car. Ethan stared through the rain-covered windshield at the dark neighborhood around them. Broken fences, sagging rooftops, empty streetlights flickering against puddles. His company owned half this block, and somehow he had never truly seen it before. The grandmother coughed softly from the back seat, pulling Ethan from his thoughts. "There is a motel about 2 miles from here," she whispered. "The Maple Inn." Ethan nodded once and shifted the SUV into drive. As they pulled away from the collapsing house, Lily continued watching it through the rear window until it disappeared into the storm. Only then did she finally whisper something so quietly Ethan almost missed it. "Thank you for coming back." The Maple Inn sat beside a deserted gas station at the edge of town, its flickering neon sign glowing faintly through the rain. The motel had probably looked outdated 20 years ago, but tonight, beneath the storm and exhaustion, it felt like shelter. Ethan parked beneath the awning and hurried around to open the back door. Cold air swept inside immediately. Lily instinctively wrapped his coat tighter around herself before helping her grandmother carefully out of the SUV. The older woman moved slowly, leaning heavily on Ethan's arm as they crossed the wet pavement together. Inside, the motel lobby smelled like old coffee and lemon cleaner. A television murmured quietly behind the front desk, while a middle-aged clerk looked up from a crossword puzzle. One glance at Lily's soaked clothes and frightened eyes erased any questions he might have had. Ethan rented the largest room available without hesitation. 2 beds, extra blankets, hot tea, soup if the kitchen still had any left. The clerk nodded quietly and disappeared toward the back. Lily stood near the heater vent in the lobby, letting warm air brush against her frozen hands. She looked small, standing there beneath the oversized charcoal coat, like a child trying to disappear inside someone else's life. Ethan noticed she still had not let go of the sleeve, as if returning the coat too soon might somehow send her back into the storm. The room itself was simple but clean. Beige walls, thin carpet, a buzzing lamp near the window. Rain streaked softly down the glass while the heater rattled unevenly near the corner. But when Lily's grandmother lowered herself onto the bed with a tired sigh, the tension in the room shifted slightly. Safe, at least for tonight. The motel employee arrived a few minutes later carrying paper bowls of chicken noodle soup, crackers, and steaming cups of tea balanced carefully on a tray. Lily stared at the food in silence, not excited, not greedy, just cautious. That hit Ethan harder than he expected. Children were supposed to rush toward comfort, toward warmth, toward food. But this little girl looked like someone waiting for permission to believe something good could actually stay. "You should eat," Ethan said gently. Lily glanced first at her grandmother before touching the soup. Only after the older woman smiled reassuringly did she finally lift the spoon. Steam curled softly around her face as she took the first bite. Then another, and another. Slowly, color began returning to her cheeks. Ethan sat quietly across the room watching rain slide down the motel window, while unfamiliar emotions settled heavily inside his chest. For years, he had built luxury towers with rooftop gardens and private gyms for people who would never worry about leaking ceilings. Meanwhile, less than 15 miles away, a little girl had been teaching herself how to survive collapsing floors and freezing winters. The contrast made him uncomfortable in ways quarterly reports never could. Across the room, Lily carefully placed the empty soup bowl on the nightstand. "That was really good," she whispered. Then she hesitated. "Most people do not come back once they leave our street." Ethan looked at her. The innocence in her voice was gone now. What remained was something older, sadder, a child measuring kindness by how temporary it usually was. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the dark Ohio sky, and for the first time in many years, Ethan Carter realized he did not want to walk away from someone's pain simply because it was inconvenient. Hours later, the storm finally began to weaken. Rain still tapped softly against the motel windows, but the violent wind had faded into a low whisper across the parking lot. Somewhere outside, tires hissed along wet pavement before disappearing back into the quiet of the night. Inside room 12, the lights were dim. Lily's grandmother had fallen asleep beneath the heavy motel blankets, her oxygen machine humming steadily beside the bed. The warm glow from the bedside lamp softened the deep exhaustion in her face. For the first time all evening, the room felt still, peaceful. Lily sat cross-legged near the heater on the carpeted floor, wrapped tightly in Ethan's coat. The sleeves covered her hands completely, making her look even smaller than before. A box of crayons and several sheets of motel stationery lay scattered beside her. Ethan noticed them while loosening his damp tie near the window. "You draw a lot," he said quietly. Lily shrugged without looking up. "Mostly when it rains." He gave a faint nod. "That often?" Another shrug. The answer was enough. For a few moments, only the sound of crayons scratching across paper filled the room. Ethan checked his phone absent-mindedly. 15 missed calls, emails from executives, messages marked urgent. Normally, he would have answered every single one immediately. Tonight, he silenced the phone and set it face down. Across the room, Lily carefully held up her drawing to inspect it beneath the lamp. Ethan caught a glimpse of bright yellow walls and blue skies. Not the collapsing house from earlier, something new. "Can I see it?" he asked. She hesitated at first, then slowly walked over and handed him the paper. Ethan stared at the drawing longer than expected. A small white house stood beneath a bright sun. Flowers lined the walkway. Smoke curled from the chimney. Beside the front porch stood 3 figures holding hands. A little girl, an older woman, and a tall man in a dark coat, the same coat Lily was wearing now. Something inside Ethan shifted quietly. "You drew me," he said softly. Lily nodded once. "You came back." The simplicity of the answer nearly broke him. Not because it was dramatic, because to her, staying mattered enough to become a picture. Ethan looked down again at the drawing. The house was imperfect. Crooked windows, uneven lines, but somehow it felt warmer than the luxury penthouse waiting for him downtown. "When I was little," Lily whispered, "my mom used to say homes can hear people." Ethan looked up. "She said some homes stay cold because nobody inside feels safe anymore." The words settled heavily into the silence. Children were not supposed to talk like that. They were supposed to worry about cartoons and school lunches and scraped knees. Not survival. Not safety. Not whether kindness would leave in the morning. Ethan carefully handed the drawing back to her. "Well," he said gently, That house in your picture looks pretty warm to me. For the first time since he met her, Lily smiled fully. It was small, tired, but real. And somehow that tiny smile changed the entire atmosphere of the room more than the heater ever could. Outside, dawn slowly began softening the edge of the storm clouds. And sitting in that cheap roadside motel, Ethan Carter realized something uncomfortable, but true. He had spent years building expensive places for strangers. But tonight, a little girl with crayons had shown him what a home was actually supposed to feel like. Morning arrived slowly over northern Ohio. The storm clouds had thinned into pale gray streaks across the sky, and weak sunlight reflected off puddles outside the motel parking lot. Trucks rumbled faintly along the highway nearby, while the smell of fresh coffee drifted through the cold morning air. Inside room 12, Ethan had not slept at all. He stood near the window in yesterday's wrinkled dress shirt, watching the early lights spread across the wet pavement outside. His mind kept replaying the same images from the night before. The collapsing roof, Lily standing barefoot in the rain, the drawings taped to the upstairs wall, families she wished existed. Behind him, the motel room remained quiet, except for the soft hum of the heater. Lily still slept, curled beneath the blankets on the second bed, clutching Ethan's charcoal coat tightly against her chest like it was something valuable. Not expensive, safe. Ethan glanced at her for a moment before his phone vibrated sharply on the nightstand. 3 new messages, then another, and another. His company logo glowed across the screen like a reminder from a different universe. Board meeting moved to 9 a.m. Demolition crew waiting for final approval. City inspectors requesting statement. Ethan exhaled slowly. Reality was catching up. He stepped quietly outside the motel room to answer the call. "Ethan, where the hell are you?" barked Richard Bennett, the company's chief financial officer. "The city already approved clearance for that neighborhood. We cannot keep delaying." Ethan stared across the parking lot in silence. A little girl had nearly died in one of those houses. But inside the boardroom, it was still being discussed like numbers on a spreadsheet. "There are still residents there," Ethan said finally. Richard sighed impatiently. 3 occupied homes on condemned property. We offered relocation vouchers months ago. And where exactly were they supposed to go? A pause. Then the colder voice returned. "That is not our responsibility." The words hit differently now, because suddenly Ethan could picture exactly who those policies affected. An elderly woman sleeping beside an oxygen machine. An 8-year-old girl listening to roofs crack during rainstorms. People invisible enough to become paperwork. "You did not see that street last night," Ethan said quietly. "No, Ethan, I saw the budget." The line went silent for a moment. Then Richard lowered his voice carefully. "Do not let one emotional situation derail a $200 million redevelopment project." Emotional situation. Ethan looked down at the motel room key in his hand. Funny how wealthy people created clean little phrases to avoid saying the word human. Inside the room, the curtain shifted slightly. Lily stood awake now near the window, watching him through the glass. Not spying, just waiting. Waiting to see if he would leave like everyone else eventually had. Ethan suddenly realized she had probably spent years reading adults that way. Studying faces, listening to tone changes, learning exactly when disappointment was coming. When he stepped back inside, Lily immediately sat back on the edge of the bed, pretending she had not been watching. "Was that your work?" she asked softly. Ethan nodded. "Are you going back?" The question sounded casual, but her fingers tightened around the sleeve of his coat again. That tiny movement nearly broke his heart. For years, Ethan Carter had believed success meant never getting emotionally attached to anything that could slow you down. But standing inside that small motel room, looking at the frightened little girl who had saved his life only hours earlier, he realized something much more frightening than failure. He did not want to become another person who disappeared from hers. By noon, the city skyline had returned to its usual rhythm. Glass towers reflected pale winter sunlight. Traffic filled the streets below. Coffee carts steamed on crowded sidewalks, while businessmen hurried through revolving doors, carrying briefcases and deadlines. Everything looked normal, but Ethan Carter no longer felt normal inside it. The boardroom on the 32nd floor buzzed with conversation as executives reviewed blueprints and financial projections across massive digital screens. Numbers glowed in polished blue columns: profit margins, demolition costs, future luxury condos. Nobody mentioned families. Nobody mentioned children. Richard Bennett stood at the front of the room, adjusting his tie confidently. Once clearance begins this afternoon, construction can start within 10 days. Several board members nodded approvingly. Then the conference room doors opened. Ethan walked in quietly. Rain stains still marked the edge of his shoes from the night before. His jaw looked tighter than usual, his expression unreadable as he moved toward the head of the table. Richard frowned slightly. "Good, we were just waiting for final authorization." Ethan remained standing. For a moment, the room fell silent except for the faint hum of the projector screens. Then he looked directly at the redevelopment plans displayed behind them. "Cancel the demolition." Several heads lifted immediately. Richard blinked. "Excuse me?" "The entire project is frozen, effective immediately." Confusion spread across the room like a ripple. One executive leaned forward carefully. "Ethan, we already secured city approval." "I know." "Then why would we stop now?" "Because last night, a little girl stood in freezing rain trying to save a stranger, while the rest of us discussed her home like it was debris." The words almost came out. Instead, Ethan placed both hands against the conference table and spoke calmly. "We failed those neighborhoods long before those buildings started collapsing." Richard's expression hardened. "This is emotional decision-making." "No," Ethan replied quietly. "Ignoring people for years was the emotional failure." The room went completely still. For the first time since founding the company, Ethan no longer sounded like a businessman protecting numbers. He sounded human. "We are not tearing down occupied homes," he continued. "We are rebuilding them. Every resident gets temporary housing, medical support if needed, and full relocation assistance during repairs." A stunned silence followed. Someone quickly calculated the cost aloud. Millions, maybe more. Richard shook his head slowly. "This will destroy quarterly earnings." Ethan looked directly at him. "Then the earnings survive without me." The statement landed like thunder. Across the city, employees inside Carter Development would spend weeks talking about that meeting. But Ethan barely remembered the silence afterward, because in his mind, he kept seeing one thing only: a little girl standing beneath a broken porch light with rain in her hair, trying to protect someone she did not even know. And suddenly, saving people mattered more to him than impressing investors ever had. 3 months later, spring arrived quietly on Ashbury Street. The snow had melted away, replaced by fresh green grass and small yellow flowers pushing through the sidewalks. Construction crews moved carefully between repaired homes, while children rode bicycles beneath bright afternoon skies that no longer felt heavy with storms. The old collapsing house at the end of the block was gone. In its place stood a small white home with a new porch, warm lights glowing behind clean windows, and flower boxes beneath the front steps. Not extravagant, not luxurious, just safe. Inside the kitchen, the smell of tomato soup and grilled cheese filled the air, while laughter drifted softly through the house. Lily sat at the table, coloring carefully across another sheet of paper, her tongue peeking slightly from the corner of her mouth in concentration. Across from her, Ethan pretended not to notice the blue marker stain she accidentally left on his sleeve. "You moved your arm," Lily argued immediately. "I absolutely did not." "You definitely did." Her grandmother laughed softly from the stove, healthier now than the frightened woman Ethan had carried from the collapsing house months earlier. The oxygen machine was gone. Color had returned to her cheeks. Healing had returned to all of them in different ways. The front door stood open, letting warm spring air drift through the hallway. Somewhere outside, wind chimes danced gently beneath the porch roof. A safe roof. That mattered more than most people realized. Ethan walked toward the living room, where one object still rested carefully on the bookshelf beside framed family photos. A broken piece of wood from the original collapsed porch. Most people would have thrown it away. Ethan kept it, because sometimes the things that nearly break us become reminders of what finally changed us. He picked up the small piece of weathered wood thoughtfully, just as Lily appeared beside him. "You still keep that ugly thing?" she asked. Ethan smiled faintly. "It reminds me to listen when smart little girls warn me about things." Lily grinned proudly at that. Then she handed him her newest drawing. This time the picture looked different. The little white house remained under a bright yellow sun. Flowers still lined the walkway, but now there were 4 people standing together beneath the porch. Lily, her grandmother, Ethan, and beside them, a golden dog with uneven ears and an oversized tail. Ethan laughed softly. "We have a dog now?" "We should," Lily said seriously. "Homes feel happier with dogs." For a moment, Ethan simply looked at her, at the warmth inside the house, at the life returning to rooms that once knew only fear and silence, at the child who had saved him long before he ever realized he needed saving too. And somewhere deep inside, a loneliness he had carried for years finally began to loosen its grip. Because sometimes the people the world overlooks the fastest are the very ones capable of rebuilding a broken heart. Not with money, not with power, but with kindness strong enough to make someone stay.